All right. I'm not going to have any slides. If you like to tweet, which I do, but I'm not going to, obviously, you can tweet to me at Chris Chidge, and maybe, I don't know, if you so desire. But I'm going to talk about a tool called Docfx. It's probably not that widely known. And I encountered it because I started doing, I'm a freelance technical writer, and I've been doing some work recently for a company who builds software in C#, which is not a language that I knew much about. But I've always known developers who use it seem to like it. So it was interesting to start with that. But it also introduces a whole other world of tooling. And when I was just sort of searching around, I came across this tool, and it's perfect for C# code bases and documenting them. But actually, as I'll show you, if you're not doing things in C#, it's actually also pretty cool. So I'm just going to make this a bit more readable. Ooh. There we go, that's better, all right. Okay, so the reason why Docfx is also interesting is it's a static site generator that's specifically aimed at documentation. A lot of documentation is used in using things like Jekyll or Middleman, which are fine and simple, but kind of lack a lot of features that you might want, especially in more complex documentation. This includes things like versioning of documentation, if you release different versions of the code, testing your examples, single sourcing, which is the concept of, say you have repeated bits of text that you only want to write once and reuse in multiple places. Something like Jekyll and Markdown doesn't really do that. There's fudges around it, but it's not really designed for that. And also special formatting that suits documentation, and we'll come to that in a minute. On the other side of the kind of Markdown world, there are actually very specific, very complex documentation tool chains, things like Data, which are these horrible, in my opinion, XML formats that you're often tied into proprietary CMSs from Adobe and people like that, but they're still very popular, especially in the enterprise world and the more traditional engineering world, as opposed to sort of software engineering. And then there's kind of a couple of things in between, tools like Sphinx, which is a restructured text static site generator, but the syntax of restructured text takes a little bit of getting used to. It's not as multi-purpose as Markdown. So anyway, the interesting thing, the reason why I liked Docfx is it kind of borrowed bits and pieces from all these various worlds and made something that I quite liked. It's currently under the stewardship of Microsoft as an open source project. I don't think they actually made it originally. I think they sort of brought it back from a dead project. And they're actually using it now on all of their Azure documentation. And they're actually looking to shift it into some other areas as well, actually. So they're starting to use it more and more. That said, there's going to be a lot of points here where I hit things that are a bit odd. It's still quite a new project. Its documentation is quite poor, which is somewhat ironic, but not unusual. But luck would have it, I actually met the person who is taking over as product manager for it at Microsoft at a recent conference in Portland. And so now I have a direct line to someone to bug, which is quite good. But yeah, let's get started. So I don't think you'd mind, actually. He's an developer relations person, so I don't think you'll mind. But so it sort of breaks down things into three parts. I'm going to look at each part, and then I'm going to we'll build a site. I'm going to use actually, I forgot some props. I'm going to use the documentation of the company that I've been working for, who is this very cool little event store. And they have this funny little, whatever it is, as a logo. I don't actually know what it is, but it's quite cute. So grab one of those if you want one later. And I'm going to use their documentation as an example in most cases. So the first thing is it introduces its own flavor of Markdown, of course. Everyone has to. That's almost as popular as JavaScript frameworks. And it's called very cleverly Docfx flavored Markdown, or DFM. But it adds quite a lot of well-implemented formatting rules that are very good for documentation, actually. And it's also a subset of GitHub flavored Markdown. So even if you ignore all the custom stuff, you can still just use quote unquote normal Markdown or Markdown that works well on GitHub and GitLab and all these things. So I'm going to show you a few examples here of some of the formatting that is quite interesting. I've just realized I'm in the wrong branch of the repository. Give me one sec. So some of the things that are quite useful are things like this, code tabs. So this renders as, I will show you roughly what it looks like. I'm going to start a build in the background and show you in a minute. And the reason why this build is quite slow, I will mention in a minute as well. We'll come back to that. So for example, here we're setting up a tabbed interface for the 3 ways to install. And it's, as you can see, it's using something fairly similar to traditional Markdown. We're using any level of heading with like a link structure, but this extra hash added here. And if we scroll down in tab 2, we have Linux instructions, and in tab 3, we have Docker instructions, and then these 3 asterisks at the bottom say that's the end of the tab group. So it creates code tabs for you quite easily. Of course, it's using JavaScript to do this, and of course, you could add this yourself, but it's quite nice that it's just included. Also, things like these pop-out boxes. It, by default, has note, warning, and info. Actually, I think maybe danger for some reason as well. But adding these yourself is quite simple. And again, of course, you could do this yourself, but it comes straight out of the box, which is quite useful. One of the other things it does, it adds a new style of, find a good example. Here we go. So, where is it? Here. So, it adds a new way of resolving links that get resolved at build time, where you don't actually have to worry too much about the whole file structure, and it will just, this is to the relative, or you could put it absolute. And this is obviously going to the particular URL, but you can also do things like add into the front matter up the top a particular ID, and then just reference the ID in those links. So if you change your file structure around, you don't have to worry about links getting broken, because it's just looking for the file with that ID and putting the correct link in. So again, it's lots of sort of quite useful little features for documentation, which tends to change quite a lot. And then one of the other probably more useful aspects here is it has, there's no real official word for this, but some call it transclusion, some call it file inclusion, but this ability to embed other files within the file. And you can do this with just normal Markdown files, but also with code. And if you see here, this is quite interesting. We're setting the formatting to bash. We give it a name, just I guess if you want to do some CSS targeting or something like that. We specify the file, but you can also do the line numbers, pull in the first line. This is just a bash command. And in the same file, I have the response, and I just say here, 3 until the end. And the advantage of doing something like this is because the code is in separate files, you can test it. Which actually, I used to do some documentation work at Contentful, and this is something we were actually looking at back then, and it was quite hard in normal Markdown. And this adds it just out of the box. So you can keep all the code separately in a separate folder and run tests to check the examples work, which is incredibly frustrating when you find code examples that don't work. So to give a little example of how this looks, obviously the resolution is going to be a bit odd, but so we have the pop-out box here. Color isn't quite great. It's bluer on my screen. And then the code tabs here, which is nice and tidy. And in case you're in any doubt, we have all those linked files here. And there's actually a lot more you can do as well. And this is one of the strange things about the project, is that there's often a lot of features that aren't documented, and you just happen to be sort of searching the repository and find it in an issue or something like that. So there's a lot more you can do actually. So that's our conceptual documentation. This is the files to explain to people how to get started, how to install, things like that. Another area of documentation we often want to include is APIs. And it's also got you sorted out here. So what is a common way of speccing APIs? Swagger is one, or Open API Spec, I think it's called now. And a lot of teams will maintain these for a variety of reasons: prototyping APIs, testing APIs, a whole bunch of ways. And you can basically take a Swagger file and also generate documentation from it. You can also do quite cool things like, say for example, you want to keep your, say for example, you want to keep your spec quite clean. Here, this is enough for the developers, but in your documentation, maybe you want to have a bit more of an explanation. In the conceptual side, you can actually override these fields with the Markdown files as well. So at build time, it will flesh out these simple descriptions into more complex descriptions. And likewise, I started experimenting, but I got a little bit lost down a rabbit hole of like embedding bits of the API into other bits of documentation and things like that. So it starts to almost be a bit too much you could do, but it's quite cool. How does this look? So this Swagger spec is still a bit lean, shall we say? So it's not the best looking thing right now, but is roughly how it looks. If anyone's ever used the, yeah, I need to fix this stuff because we've got just the same thing repeated 3 times, but you get a very rough outline. If anyone's ever used like the Swagger UI, it doesn't quite offer that level of interactivity or anything like that, but it's, you know, to have everything in the same place and looking similar is quite useful. And I've also added some plugins here that split all the endpoints up. By default, it's just one large file, but this is quite a large API, so I'm still experimenting with the best way to display it. The only downside is it has to be in JSON, which, depending on your perspective, is not the easiest thing to look at. And some people prefer YAML, I don't know. So actually, I personally do it in YAML, and I just have something in the build script that converts it to JSON before it builds the site. Okay, next, what about documenting the code base? Not something that's quite so common, but it's possible. This is one of the features where it's predominantly aimed at C#. And if any of you have ever seen C#, or actually I think it's similar in a lot of other languages, you have things like, I have to find an example. It's an open source project, so I'm not showing you anything, but I just need to find. Of course, every file I'm opening is not a good example. Anyway, in there somewhere. There we go. So this is these XML style comments that are common in C#, but also some other languages. And it basically takes these, parses these, and documents the code base. And to give you again, obviously it's not going to be ideal. This is really aimed for reference, not for necessarily understanding too much. My mouse not working. Okay. Live demo fail. I can't click a link for some random reason. Out of all the things that could go wrong, that was okay. I don't know what's going on there, but again, it generates HTML files that look somewhat like this, but methods and arguments and return values and things like that instead. I can hear you saying that's great, Chris, but I don't use C#, which is not that uncommon in the kind of startup world. There is actually a third-party plugin called, let's got a very unmemorable name called Node2Docfx, which you can actually run over a Node code base and does the same thing. So I'm not going to run it right now because I want to keep the other one running in the background. But this is an example I found here where it just generates the spec from an Azure Node module and then generates HTML from it here, basically. So yeah. And there's also plugins for Python and TypeScript, but they're in progress at the moment. So actually, documenting your code base is not something people do that often, but if you do want to and you don't want to do C#, there's actually also an option. The other downside of this, if you are doing it in C#, is the command to generate the HTML from the code comments only works on Windows at the moment. It's the only thing in this entire package that only works on Windows. So I have a Windows machine for testing some of this stuff, but I can't do it here, unfortunately. Everything else works fine though. All right, templating. We all know in most static site generators, we have templates that we can sort of do dynamic replacement. What is, I can't actually click on things today. Whilst I'm doing this, I'm using Visual Studio Code as well. I'm normally an Atom user, but because they're both Microsoft tools, unsurprisingly, Visual Studio Code has a Docfx plugin. So it's far better to use. So templating, you can actually use Liquid or Mustache. So if you come from a Jekyll background, you can carry on using Liquid. If you come from a more JavaScript background, you can use Mustache for templating. And I found in some respects here is a little brittle. Some of the features, especially things like it has search built in, which uses Luna, which again is a common thing to use in static sites, or the filtering options or some of those tabs are a little bit based on some of the default templates. And I have found that if I've changed the structure too much, some of that stuff breaks, but it's fairly easy to fix and find where it is. It uses the concept of overrides. So these files are the only ones we've changed, and we build on the default template and just change the things we want to change, which is adding some custom styles, and we added some extra text into the footer and a few things like that. And if you've ever looked at Mustache, this will look, oops, that's probably the worst one to look at. There we go. It's not syntax highlighted, unfortunately, but this will look vaguely familiar. It's not a Docfx thing, it's a Mustache thing. You can have logic and things like that, and there's parameters set in pages or in a global context that you can change the output depending on. So is search enabled, then show search. Are breadcrumbs enabled, show breadcrumbs, etc. So you can get quite a lot of logic in here as well. All right, so we've got all the various components. How do we get from that to this? How do we get to the final site? This is probably one of the parts where, depending on the sort of person you are, Docfx is either great or terrible. Because the building process and configuration stuff is quite thorough, and you can take it to all sorts of levels if you want to, or you can just leave it very default. So there's actually kind of two aspects of configuration. One is this config file, which contains a bunch of different groups here. So this metadata section is the bit that generates the code comments that I can't run on the Mac. And you can also filter. So for example, we're not generating documentation for all the tests because it's not so interesting, maybe, I don't know. And then we have global metadata. This is some of those parameters I just showed you in the template, things like enabling search or not. And you might have noticed as I was clicking through, it has contribution links built straight in. And you can just set the branch and you automatically get a link for people to make changes on your Git repository of choice. Moving down, you then have a list of files. Now, in this case, it should be simple. We include the JSON file and we include some generic files, the code files. Here, unfortunately, we get into one of the limitations. Unlike Jekyll and more sort of traditional static site generators that let you change the path structure to whatever you want, Docfx is very much out of the box to just give you blah, blah, blah.html. Whereas often you want clean URLs, like the slash and then no.html. And the only way we managed to find to get that to work was doing this very horrible workaround of basically manually declaring every single path. But I requested this as a good idea for a feature, and they're working on it for the next version. So this will be gone soon, hopefully. Because at the moment, it's kind of crazy. Like 75% of the config file is just that. And then you have things like the assets, where you want to build to, what you want to exclude. And here is kind of where the templating thing works. So default is default. Anything overridden in our custom template, anything overridden, and these are the two REST plugins that I mentioned earlier that group the output in different ways. The other area of configuration, which is actually quite interesting, it might initially seem slightly tedious, but actually gives you the ability to have quite nice structure instead of having to do kind of manual menus and things like you do often in some static site generators. You have this TOC file, so table of contents, where you can actually kind of completely define the table of contents that appears A, on the menus, but B, also kind of setting the relation of things for breadcrumbs and stuff like that. And these links can be like this. They can be absolute links to other HTML, to other websites. They can be links to folders. So you could just say, link to this folder and then just go through all the sub items. But this is enabling me here to do like very precise ordering of documents instead of just alphabetical order, or I think in Jekyll you often do like some kind of crazy weight parameter in the YAML front matter to get something similar. So the initial setup of this is a little long-winded, but in the long run it gives you this very finessed control over the ordering of things. And then basically you just build, which is, it has a CLI tool. You have a build command, you have a serve command, or build and serve, specifying the file. And there's a few other elements as well. You can override some of the parameters at the command line and things like that. The other downside of the project so far is there is no incremental build right now. So this project has a lot of files because of the HTTP API and the code base. So building it takes a while. And you'll see why in a minute, because there's like 1,500 files. But again, incremental build is, I think, top on the feature request list. So that should be hopefully coming soon. You get a lot of nice, interesting build parameters because it does a lot of this link checking and things like that. You get a lot of nice messages about what could be improved, warnings and errors. And you can see here, so this is weird. It says it doesn't do incremental, but sometimes you get inconsistent numbers here. And I've found that I tend to just delete the build folder and then definitely know I'm starting from scratch. So it's an early project, but if you're doing documentation work, pretty interesting. And yeah, as I said, you get search out the box. So I can just start typing and we get search automatically. You have things like filtering here. If I had it enabled, you have automatic breadcrumbs at the top. A lot of these lovely JavaScript features, subsections in the documentation, Git collaboration on it, and a whole bunch of other things. So yeah, in summary, it's still slightly early days, but actually for documentation projects, I find it well, it's got a great feature set. I wouldn't call it perfect because there's a lot of problems with it still, but the feature set for documentation is great. And yeah, it doesn't have to be a C# code base at all, as most of the features I showed you have nothing to do with that at all. And well, it's being run by Microsoft, who I think is sticking around for a while. So it's not going anywhere anytime soon. Yeah. Any questions?
I've noticed that you've got your program available only on Windows, Linux, and Docker. Have you thought of Apple? Oh. I'm not an Apple user, by the way, but I felt
this is a product question.
Yeah.
Officially, these are the 3 supported, but unofficially, it works. It's a .NET Core application, so it works under Mono. Actually, one of the head engineers, when I said to him, "Is there a homebrew package?" He's like, "No, I don't really know why. That would be really easy." So yes, it's just, I think it's just the developers and the audience has come from a very strong Windows background, but most production systems are Linux, and that's just a priority. And that's basically the only reason, but I'm running it on a Mac. I'm mostly using Docker, but I can actually build and run it through Mono as well. So yeah. I know it's quite unusual to see a product with first case Windows installation. It's been an experience for me as well.
Any more questions?
But give it a go. Docfx itself is in Homebrew if you're a Mac user, and also chocolatey if you're a Windows user, so you can have nice packaging goodness. Yeah, so the style by default is kind of buried somewhere in whatever you install, and if you want to override it, you find it in the GitHub repository, and then just take out the files you want and override them. It's actually, because I used to years ago work in the Drupal world, and this was a similar concept. I think Joomla did the same thing as well, like this overriding of the individual bits you want to override. Yeah, but it's all in there in the code base. And it's open source Microsoft, it's not. Just to clarify things. Yeah, sure.
So, would I be right to say that you could characterize this interface as more of a platform? And how interchangeable would it be for someone who's wanting to approach it more from a background?
For Docfx? Well, I mean, this is specifically, I say, aimed mostly at documentation work, but if you're doing the actual writing, I mean, it's something at the most back end I can really tell you is the Markdown files. It's much like normal Markdown, apart from some of the custom stuff. And actually, if you're on, because it's a subset of GitHub flavored Markdown. Oh, I'm not on the internet, but some of those special tags don't render in GitHub, but it's readable. I think that's actually the interesting thing. For example, like the code tabs, whilst they don't obviously render on GitHub, they look okay. They look readable for anyone who's just editing on GitHub as well. Yeah, I'm not sure if that answers your question or not. And yeah, thanks for having me. If anyone wants an event store sticker, come and grab me. If anyone wants one of my stickers, come and grab me. They're fresh off the printing press. And thanks very much.
Thanks, Chris.
Oh.
Always annoying. To rewrite code, which is actually in your code, just tell other people how to use the code you actually already wrote. Is there other implementations?
I got slightly lost by that question, but
what I like that you can actually embed your code from a file.
Exactly, yeah.
Because very often I end up writing
yes.
code, then I tell people how to use the code by copying the code.
Yes. And actually, I think this is one of the best features in some respects, because in theory, you could just pull the examples straight from the code base. So you keep everything in one place and then nothing goes out of sync. It's actually, I think, so restructured text and ASCII doc, I think, do that as well. It's not a unique idea, but it is quite a cool idea, because then, yeah, you don't end up with duplication. And we all know that people in tech companies are not the best at communicating with each other sometimes. So things can slip out of sync very, very quickly. So that's actually a very cool thing you can do. You can literally just pull in examples straight from the code base. There was one I used to use called Hercules, but it was very rudimentary. It just pulled in a file. And then, yeah, you start looking at RST, does it. But yeah, for sure. And then all the single sourcing, like the XML-based formats do it. But yeah, so this is probably the best compromise way without having to learn anything crazily new. Yeah.